Thanks a lot, Kanika, for the moderation and especially stepping in on a short term. So this is really excellent. And I'm really happy to have an exciting panel following. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And I hope you can see it. Can you? Okay, excellent. So for the ones of you who don't know REN21 yet, and so there might be some, we're basically the only global network of renewable energy and bringing together players from governments, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, science and academia, and industry associations. What we are doing is actually working together to make the shift to renewables happen now. And how are we doing this? It's really by developing shared and collaborative knowledge, like the Renewables Global States Report, to inform but also influence decision makers. And if we say like making the shift to renewables now, it is really because it is time to act. The Renewables Global States Report is a report we are producing since 2005 and which is really building on this community of players who work together. And here we are basically providing every year facts, information, data, and trends on the renewable energy development worldwide, all renewable energy technologies and all end-use sectors. And I'm going to show you a bit basically the results on 2019 developments. But before doing so, I do think that in particular in times of COVID, it's really important to see what renewable energy means. And renewable energy is not only renewable energy. It is also about clean air and a healthy environment. It's about fewer CO2 emissions. It's creating economic opportunities and providing decent jobs. And in particular in developing and emerging countries, it's also about affordable and inclusive energy. And I think especially in COVID times, one of the aspects which is important too is that renewable energy means energy security and sovereignty. Why is it important to have these things in mind, especially in these short-term discussions? And Kanika mentioned it, we're living in a crazy time, I'd say. It is important to step back to see what has happened in 2019 to really see what changes are needed, because here we're talking about structural changes that cannot be overlaid and ignored because of a short-term tension we have for the moment. So what are the 2019 developments? I think as in many former years, but even in an accelerated way, we do clearly see very positive developments again. We had a record of 200 gigawatts of installed capacities in the power sector added in 2019. This has in particular been driven by solar photovoltaics, but also wind and hydropower. Solar photovoltaics represented almost 60% of the renewable power capacities. And what is really interesting here, I think, is that we see that renewable energy today is a global story. Renewable power is a global story. It is spreading everywhere. And in 2019, there were more than 1 gigawatt of installed capacities in 47 countries. How is this possible? This is possible because costs have gone down so significantly and continue to go down. And as a result, we see that, for instance, basically renewable energy in developing countries, even though China and India have contracted in 2019, is still one of the areas where installed capacities is growing most. We also see, and I think in particular in the African and Asian context, we do see that this also leads to market developments in the use of renewable energy for energy access, with 35 million units being installed in the off-grid sector. We also see this in solar lanterns, etc. And cost is really a key driver, which is entering in all markets, in the power markets, in all regions, but also leads to the fact that citizens, but also the private sector are really engaging in the story. In markets where we have renewable energy power shares, basically renewable power shares in the grids, which are more mature already, we see that this leads to the fact that we also have more variable renewable electricity in the grids. And this clearly means that we need to think about new market developments. Now, is this enough? When we're looking into renewable investment, it is not enough. Here we have the investment in renewable power and in fuels. And we do see that basically in 2019, the investment were of $282 billion US. It's only an increase of 1%. This is explained by the fact that costs went down, but still when we consider the effort required to reach the Paris Agreement, it is very clear that we need to ramp up investment in renewable energy. What is interesting again, as I mentioned before, is that developing emerging economies have for the 5th year surpassed the developed countries in terms of investment. So in the power sector, great news, but still not enough. There is, however, another aspect, and from REN21 side, so you might expect the brand new news from 2019, and again, we are telling the same story. We are not on track. Renewable power is only a part of the picture, and this means like renewable or electricity only represents 17% in the total final energy demand. And this is the area where we have the story, and we are reaching 26.4% of renewable energy is covering basically the power demand. But in the heating and cooling and the transport sector, which represent actually the bulk of the energy demand, nothing has been happening throughout the last years. We're still at a share of renewable energy of 10% in heating and cooling and 3.3% in transport. Only a very, very slight increase in the transport sector. And this is basically where we have a clear urgency to move from a power transition to an energy transition. Now, there are sectoral challenges that are clear. I am not going to go into detail here, but there are two aspects, which are these sectors depend highly on fossil fuel. And obviously, the fact that fossil fuel is still being subsidized in many countries, I think the latest IEA data is 500 billion euros of fossil fuel subsidies for 2019. So this is distorting the market. And even if renewable energy costs have gone down significantly, that is something where we're not operating in market with fair market rules. The other part is, however, also that very clearly in sectors that highly depend on fossil fuels, you also have players that highly depend on fossil fuels. And I think that is something where in COVID times, we also clearly need to accompany these players who are either part in the fossil fuel supply side, but also in the consumption side to engage in the transition, create the markets, the industry, accompany them to change jobs and engage in the transition. Now, one aspect, which is clearly a main barrier, however, to make this transition happen in these energy sectors is the lack of policy support. You have here the examples of basically the regulated frameworks and regulated policies for renewable energy. In the power sector, we had 143 countries that had these regulated policies, compared to 17 in transport, and here we mainly have biofuels, and 23 only in heating and cooling. And that is obviously something which is a major problem, because if we're in the power sector where we are today, this is because governments had leadership, a vision, defined targets and strategies to get there. There was an industrial development, market development that led into innovation and cost reductions. And we cannot make basically the shift happen in the other energy sectors if we don't learn from the success story and replicate it there. And one of the sad stories, I guess, from the GSR 2020 and 2019 developments is that basically the policy situation in heating, cooling, and transport has not evolved over the last 2 years. So it's like flat, and this seems that some policymakers and governments are still not hearing that there is really a need to also have sectoral targets. What is interesting is, however, there are approximately 20 countries that have carbon pricing policies, and this is obviously something which is also leading to renewable energy, or can at least lead to renewable energy development in these sectors. So what is the overall story? And I'm So I really invite you to have a look at the GSR, because there is much more stories. My team told me don't speak more than 10 minutes, so I'm really trying to stick to this more or less. But so the overall story is clearly renewables is growing, and there is a success story, but it's not fast enough. It's not fast enough in the power sector, and it's not happening in the other end-use sectors. And on this slide, which is a bit a tricky slide, but you see like the energy demand has grown from 353, that's the orange bar, to 378 in 5 years' time. So it's a growth of 7.2%. In the same time, renewable energy has grown by 21.5%. So that is really a success story. But the level is starting really low, and renewables do not allow to cover the energy demand. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is that, unfortunately, if we're really serious about Paris, and if we're serious about sustainable developments, we also need to make a more radical shift, which is not only reducing energy efficiency, but also developing renewables and banning fossil fuels. So there are many existing solutions, and I think that is the part which is encouraging. The actions to be taken in parallel are clearly to support renewable energy across all energy sectors, make energy efficiency mandatory to decrease energy demand, accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels, and also the phase out of fossil fuel subsidy. That is something which is very clear, and we cannot have a better moment than a moment where oil and gas prices are so low as they are. And then the other part is really to accompany the sectors to engage into this change. And I think in the economic recovery discussion, it clearly means that we have the opportunity of huge investments that can be directed toward this transition, or toward the development of a sustainable, efficient, and renewable energy system. This money can only be spent once. And as a result, we need to really take the right decisions with regard to this. It's very clear that 2019 stories show that there is a systemic problem, and just supporting renewable energy won't be enough and requires a systemic solution. And as I mentioned before, so we have a feature in this edition which is about public support for renewable energy. Clearly, 2019 was a moment where we have seen a lot of mobilization of the population all over the world to ask policymakers to be more ambitious in terms of climate change engagement. We also saw many lawsuits, actually, against governments, against corporations, etc., to basically respect the Paris Agreement. And that is something which is very encouraging. We see, however, that at the local level, there might also be a pushback of renewable energy solutions. So that's why clearly in the last GSR, we have a specific feature on the public support for renewable. And what we see here, there are, and I will not go into detail because we have a great panel to talk about this, but there are three aspects. There is a socio-political acceptance, there is a market acceptance. So how are basically also investors, financial institutions, etc., responding to this, and the community acceptance. The good news is opinion polls show that globally there is a big support to renewable energy. Now, we also need to see that governments have the possibility to shape this support and help to increase the support by awareness campaigns, but also by policy that encourage public engagement with renewable energy, where basically population will also take a benefit of it. And I think especially when it comes to the just transition, inclusiveness, job creation, etc., that is an aspect which is important, but also really leading to public participation, control, and ownership. So possibly shifts in governance. There are many examples about this in the report, and I invite you all to visit our website to have a look. And so it was kind of 10 minutes and a bit, and I'm handing over again to Kanika. I'm looking forward to the roundtable discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, but we are also not off the hook just yet. Before the roundtable, we'll ask you a few questions. There were quite a few questions that came in while you were presenting. And I think that one of the findings, Rana, year on year, is that we see that while the power sector's decarbonization is sort of doing fairly well, there's quite a lot of policy ambition as well that countries around the world are showing. The same is not true for transport and heating and cooling. And what do you identify after, not just this GSR, but sort of several years of watching this pattern unfold as some of the challenges towards more ambitious policy making in that space?
Mm-hmm. So that is something which depends very much on the sectors, but very clearly there is not a very strong, the systems approach is not implemented. So I take the example in the transport sector. We see the development of electric mobility, but there is only one country that ensures in this transition that the power which is used to power the electric vehicles is renewable energy, and that is Austria. And that is something which has not changed since a couple of years. And we even see that now with the economic recovery packages, there is a lot of discussion about e-mobility, etc. And this thinking is not integrated. So there is really a disconnect between players talking to each other and a much more holistic approach in terms of connecting budgets and having integrated policy and regulatory frameworks. In the heating sector, we speak more about efficiency, for instance, in buildings, but renewables also play a big role here. And another aspect is clearly that heating is, or buildings is a more decentralized or very local market. So there is not a lot of consolidated information. We see that it's often cities being active here and that many cities don't see themselves as an energy player. And so they are missing basically in the debate. But we also see that there is not really a strong voice of renewable heat, basically. There are obviously some structural parts, so we need to also invest into infrastructure. But all in all, I think there is, on the one side, policymakers not really thinking about having sectoral targets, and that is something which is needed. If you want to have a vision, so it's good to have a vision, but you also need the strategy and the implementation to decide how to go there. The other part is that basically we need to bridge players. And the third part is that as renewable players, we really need to speak about us being sustainable energy players and connecting with each other and having kind of a meta narrative, I guess, to make the transition happen.
I think that's a really good sort of way of framing what we are going to discuss in the panel as well. But before we move into that, maybe a quick response as well on what you think, will COVID-19 and the associated economic downturn that the whole world is seeing will it undo or set back the advances that renewables have made in recent years? Or do you think that because it kind of puts climate change and existential crises front and center, that it's actually going to help accelerate some of those actions?
Mm-hmm. So again, I think there is, unfortunately, never a black and white discussion. There is an opportunity here. I really think in the power sector, and we see it like 2/3 of the new investment in power capacities is building on renewable power because it is the least cost option. So basically in the power sector, it's a no-brainer. And still we see that, especially in, I think it's 80% in Asia, but that when you're looking into pipeline capacities of coal-fired power plants, we are talking about 500 gigawatt of installed capacity that are there. So even though it seems to be a no-brainer, there is clearly still a push. And we also see that in the economic recovery packages, there is some packages that are clearly supporting coal, natural gas, oil, and this is basically a no-go. It's almost a crime, I guess, considering the climate change which is there. I mean, let's be really honest, and I think we're also in a time where we need to be much more outspoken on the realities. It is an opportunity because investments are taken and there is an opportunity to direct them into sustainable areas. We need, however, to be very clear on the fact it's not, the economic recovery packages are not going to do the work on driving a structural change which is required if we're serious about Paris and the Sustainable Development Goal. And I think especially in fossil fuel dependent sectors like heating, cooling and transport, obviously the low oil and gas prices are representing a risk because they are not incentivizing players to move in that direction. And this is clearly where governments and political leadership is really fundamental. And if governments are not moving, we need to build on private sector and citizens to make the reality happen and create the right pressure. But also on the renewable community, I think, to speak up.